in Europe from the North Sea. This is Radio Caroline.
Radio Caroline with Europe's non-stop hit music.
I'd always wanted to be on the radio. I'd dabbled. I'd done some land-based pirate stuff in the 70s. I'd written off tapes like I guess lots and lots of people of my generation had done, sent tapes off and letters, please give me a job on the radio. And it never came to fruition, although my very first job was with the BBC. I worked in an office. So I wrote to them and said I'd like to read the news, be on Radio 1. And they said, yeah, go into accounts. So I did that. But it was in the 80s that I went out to Caroline to work. I'd been going out on boat trips, the anorak boat trips, these clandestine boat trips. Caroline would always say that they were serviced from Spain. So I went out on boats from the Spanish resort of Brightlingsea and the Spanish resort of Wallasey Island and the Spanish resort of Burnham-on-Crouch. So I'd been going out on these boats and then the chance was there to go out and work on the station. And I did. I nearly went out in the 70s. I knew the chief engineer through some Dutch friends of mine. And he said, well, come out. And at the time, I was doing a job that I couldn't really leave at that particular time. But I thought, yeah, March 1980, I'll go out there and work. And then the ship sank. So I wasn't to be out there in the 70s. But it was in 1980, 85, 86, I was going out on these visitor trips, anorak trips, they called them. It's the people that were excited, I suppose, by offshore radio were called anoraks. It was an affectionate term. But I'm proud to be an anorak. And then worked out there in 1987. Only for a few weeks. I was out on board for about 6 weeks. And I was due to go back again in October, November 87. In fact, I should have been on board when the 300-foot high mast came tumbling down in the middle of a storm. But I hadn't been able to get out there the weekend before because the seas had been so rough and there was no tender boat then. And I'm pretty grateful for that because I don't think I'd have wanted to have been on the ship. I've got friends that were on the ship at the time, and from what they've told me, pretty frightening. I think I'd have jumped off and tried to walk home, I think.
Yes, I imagine it's quite a difficult experience back in the day, being on sea for several days on end. Or were you living that experience?
Yeah, I was out there, as I say, for 6 weeks. I mean, others did it for much, much longer and went back and back and back and back. There was one guy, Mike Barrington, who was out there for a year and a day. And I remember I was out on one of the visitor trips when he came back and he hadn't been on land for over a year. I don't think I could have done that. I'd have been stir crazy. I loved the experience, but 6 weeks was enough at a time for me. But yes, I would have gone back and I have continued my relationship with Caroline all the way through.
And what was it like during that time? I mean, I imagine it was still a reel-to-reel tape and vinyl, of course.
Yeah, it was all vinyl and knobs on the mixing desk. Nowadays, like you have here, Craig, it's just a little tiny desk and all touch sensitive. But this was great big knobs from an American desk and equipment that was made in the 50s. And when Caroline got it to equip their ship in 1983, they got it from a museum. So it was way past its sell-by date, but even now the equipment is still on the ship, and it's still usable. It was made to a very high standard, and although it's valves and old bits and pieces of stuff that they made radio equipment out of, it still works. Although we choose when we do the live broadcasts from the ship to Manx Radio at the end of every month, we choose to use a digital version. So it is the future.
And you've recently come back to Radio Caroline, haven't you, on the Ross Revenge?
Yeah, I'd always kept in touch with Caroline, and I was lucky enough for 30 years to work for Essex Radio on Breeze, and then a number of BBC stations, and I set up a station for a group called Tyndall in North Norfolk, and I do stuff for KDKA in America, in Pittsburgh as well. But you never really forget your first girlfriend, your first love. And I suppose Caroline was my first love. I got a job because of Caroline. It wasn't my intention, but I've worked on the radio because of Caroline. So I suppose what I do now is a bit like community service. It's payback time. And I do a weekly programme online. Caroline is online. So I do every Friday afternoon from 2 until 5. But also at the end of every month, Caroline teams up with Manx Radio in the Northwest. And we do the programmes live from the ship. And they're, via mobile phone technology, get to the Isle of Man, where they're rebroadcast on old-fashioned AM technology. So we in effect broadcast from the ship on the River Blackwater to the Isle of Man and Northern Ireland, southwest Scotland, the northwest, so Cheshire, Lancashire, Merseyside, and a bit of Southern Ireland as well. And of course, that's online. So I mean, online now, anywhere in the world, very much like Hospital Radio Chelmsford. You can be anywhere and listen. You can be anywhere to do the programmes, but we choose to go out to the ship at the end of every month.
And part of the fun of pirate radio must be the fact that you've got far less restrictions. You've got kind of freedom to kind of create whatever you like, I suppose.
Well, yeah, but if you play the cards right, I've had 30 years of being able to do that, really. I don't break the rules, but you can bend them. The rules are there to be bent. And there are ways of playing it the way that you want to do it. I mean, I'm lucky enough now that I've sort of retired, but I'm back on BBC Essex every Saturday morning. When Lou, the boss, the managing editor at BBC Essex said, "Will you come back, Ray?" And I said, "Well, I'd be delighted to. What do you want me to do?" And she said, "Well, be Ray." So I take that to mean be Ray means I choose my songs as well. But even then, a lot of disc jockeys will say, "Oh, I don't like radio nowadays because it's all the music's chosen by computer." That's not such a bad thing as I see it, because if you're doing a regular programme, if you're choosing the music for your programme once, that's okay. But if you're having to do it day in, day out, it gets very, 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 very difficult, because you're thinking, well, did I play that yesterday? I can't think of another good song. Whereas if the computer is deciding what songs the radio station plays, I don't have a big problem with that. You wouldn't want to listen to a rock station and hear Mantovani or Strauss. So, computers can work out the difference. So I'm not 100% anti-computer like a lot of radio presenters, disc jockeys, call them what you will, like a lot of them are.
But I'm sure you missed the atmosphere, though. Just the sights, and I suppose the sea never stayed stable for a moment.
No, I'm not a good sailor. I mean, I was out there in a force 10 gale, and I've read the news with a brown paper bag in my hand. But when it was calm, it was beautiful. And even in the Blackwater now, the ship is moored in the Blackwater, and it's done its days of rough, violent seas. But it can still get a bit choppy there. I was out there about 18 months ago when we had, was it Hurricane Katie or Wind Katie, Storm Katie? And, the ship was moving around quite a bit, more than I wanted it to anyway.
And, of course, you've recently created a wonderful history in book form of the life of Radio Caroline throughout the decades. How did that come about? Was that something that you've always wanted to do?
No, I'd never thought of it at all. It sounds silly, but I hadn't. I mean, if we start 1964, I was 9 years old, and I remember hearing Caroline probably on the first, second, third day. Everybody says, "Oh, I was there on the first day. I heard it on the first day." I don't think too many people were, but I will claim to have been, as a 9-year-old, listening during the Easter holidays from school. And I was hooked on it. I thought this was so exciting. There were these guys in this rusty old ship, being ill, being seasick, just to play me a Beatles record. And it captured my imagination. All the way through the 60s, I loved it, and then listened in the 70s and then the 80s. Now, I was lucky enough in the 80s, 90s to do a few documentaries, and that meant meeting and interviewing many of the disc jockeys who'd been my heroes. Micah Hearn, sadly no longer around now, but Johnny Walker, Robbie Dale, Tony Blackburn, all people like this that I'd listened to and I'd interviewed them. So fast forward to about 2012, I think it was 2013, and it was coming up for Caroline's 50th birthday. And I was meeting up with another former radio colleague. He works for the BBC down on the South Coast. So once, twice a year, we normally meet at Lakeside. And I got there first. And if you're a guy and you're going to Lakeside, the ladies have got all those shops to choose from. But if you're a fella, it's Curry's or Dixon's or whatever it's called now, and the Apple shop. And you look at all the gadgets and all the stereos, and then you go to the bookshop. So I went to Waterstones, and I was looking for the radio books, and there was nothing much there, just a book about the Archers, and then there's some music books. There's always books about Led Zeppelin and Coronation Street, and that was about it. And I thought, well, Caroline's coming up for the 50th anniversary. Nobody's written a book about it. I'm lucky enough to have interviewed an awful lot of people, and I know a lot of the story. Perhaps I should do it. So I went home. And I just sort of got this idea in my head, let's write a book. I'd never done anything like that before. And I sent off emails to about half a dozen publishers. And I'd heard the stories that if you want to write a book, nobody ever responds. But four of the first publishers responded quickly as well, all saying no thank you. But at the same time saying, but don't give up because it's a good story, but it's not for us. And that encouraged me. And then I just sent another 2 or 3 emails off and hit home with the history press. I thought, history? Caroline, 50 years, that's history. Although they were more used to publishing books about kings and queens from the Middle Ages. But yeah, they liked the idea. I wrote the book, and everybody seems to be quite pleased with it, and it's selling okay. You're not going to get rich out of writing a book, but twice a year I get a check which pays for a good meal or a weekend away. So yeah, it's okay, and it was a fun thing to do as well.
And that all goes to show just how important the history of pirate radio is to radio in general, because it kind of invented the modern sound of radio as we know it.
Yeah, I think so. If you listen back to some of the recordings of Caroline in the 60s, in the 70s, I dare say into the 80s as well. Oh, it's boring. It was, but, it was better than what else we had at the time. And it was an adventure. But more importantly than that, it's social history. It's just as important as for us as colour television or for the invention of, the food mixer or whatever. It affects our everyday life. And although the pirates aren't on now, not the shipborne pirates, but Caroline is still on, and people still remember affectionately those days as well. And many of the presenters still, be they from the 60s, 70s or 80s, still started their career on the radio. I mean, in 20, 30, 40 years' time when we've all gone, perhaps people will look back differently. But to me, in my childhood, all the way through my growing up period, it was an exciting time, and I was lucky enough to have played a tiny, tiny part in it.
And also, I've been asking all the DJs if they had a favourite record that was kind of seminal of that time. I mean, obviously, it was easier for the 60s DJs because everything was brand new and coming out. But I was wondering if there was anything which kind of summarised your time best to you.
Well, there's two. There is one that I always remember as a listener, as a 9-year-old. And by this time I was 10, I think. It was House of the Rising Sun. And I can still remember the magic of hearing that on Caroline, on my little transistor radio that I'd got. And I had it taped to the handlebars of my bike, so I'd pedal around the Burnham marshes and down to Crixie and listening to Caroline, and there was House of the Rising Sun. So that's one. Or of my time when I was there, I remember the first song that I played on the ship, and it was Graceland by Paul Simon. And whenever I hear that now, my mind's transported back immediately back to the Ross Revenge, to Radio Caroline in the 80s when we had millions of listeners across Europe, and thinking, gosh, I've really gone and done it now. I've signed up for Caroline, and here I am playing the first record. In a moment, I'll have to speak.